and welcome. We are live. Welcome to our third in a series of Climate Champion talks on hydrogen, cement, steel, food, and more. How hydrogen can decarbonize the stuff we make and the things we do. I'm Beth Evans, Global Director of News with Platts, and we provide insights and price assessments around hydrogen and the overall energy transition. This final H2 Talks panel rounds out our discussion about hydrogen. In the first two talks, we established the basic facts, what hydrogen is, how it's used, and how it can work with renewable energy to address climate change. If you missed them, check out the replays on the Climate Champions website. Today, we'll delve deeper into how hydrogen can decarbonize industrial and manufacturing processes, and how hydrogen can lower emissions in hard-to-abate sectors. And we'll explain what hard to abate means. Joining me today are Pasi Vainikka, CEO of Solar Foods, Andreas Wagner, Hydrogen Lead with the Energy Transitions Commission, and Chris Manson-Whitton, Director at Progressive Energy. Pasi, Andreas, and Chris, let's go around the virtual room so you can tell us a bit about yourselves and the companies you represent. Pasi, you want to start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I'm CEO at Solar Foods. We are a spin out from our National Research Institute. We've been operating a bit more than 3 years. Are going to bring to the market our ingredient outside Europe in the next 12 months, and in the European Union in, let's say, 2 years. Building our first factory now. I used to be a researcher at the National Research Institute on renewable energy systems, including hydrogen generation for more than 15 years. But that's what we are doing also at Solar Foods now, turning electricity and then hydrogen to edible calories.
Thank you. And Andreas, how about over to you?
Well, hello, and my name is Andreas, and I'm working as the Hydrogen Lead at the Energy Transitions Commission. So we are a coalition of around 45, 50 members across the energy landscape, heavy industries, as well as finance and civil society. And we're all aligned across the goal of getting to net zero by 2050, sticking to the Paris Agreement and limiting global warming to around 1.5 degrees C. We're developing pathways as well as recommendations and critical actions that need to happen now to get us on a pathway to net zero by mid-century. And as part of this, I've worked on hydrogen for about a year, and we recently published a report on that explicit topic and the role of clean hydrogen in a net zero economy by 2050 and what we need to do to get there.
Thank you, and I hope we'll talk a bit about that report during this chat. And Chris, over to you.
Thank you. 70% of the world's fossil emissions have happened in my lifetime. And that's something that really bothers me. And that's something that I'm passionate about. We need to address that. And Progressive Energy is a company looking to take material quantities of CO2 out of our energy systems. We've been dealing with CCS and hydrogen for over 20 years. We are delivering HyNet, and HyNet is the UK's leading hydrogen and CCS cluster that will be making large quantities of hydrogen and CO2 by 2025 and potentially replacing nearly 50% of the region's natural gas with hydrogen by 2030. And we're going to use that hydrogen to mean that the stuff that we make in the region is low carbon, to give us power when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, or even potentially to heat our homes as well, to keep them low carbon. So I'm passionate about HyNet, I'm passionate about hydrogen, passionate about CCS, and really looking forward to this conversation.
Wow, I'm excited. The passion is showing through. Let's go to the first question I have for you all, and that is around just basically why is decarbonizing industrial and manufacturing processes so important? Which ones in particular can help us reach net zero? Who wants to take that?
I'll give you a starter to get going, which is the first question, is why is it so important? So back in 2019, I'll take a UK example. Our Committee on Climate Change showed a graph which showed what our carbon emissions have done over the last 20 or 30 years And we've done really well. They're about halved. That's our kind of stack emissions of carbon. But they also showed a graph that looked at our CO2 consumption over that period. And that stayed pretty flat. So even though we've about halved the amount that goes up the stack in the CO in the UK, we pretty much double that number when you think about the carbon embodied in the stuff that we use. And that's why dealing with stuff and industrial products is really important.
And Andreas, what do you think?
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. So first of all, I think if you look towards getting to net zero, you need to, first of all, electrify as much as you can. So let's use renewables, that's solar and wind, in all the sectors where we possibly can, and really electrify as much industry as possible. But however, there is industries that you can't simply electrify. And that's what is generally referred to as harder to abate sectors. And that includes shipping, long distance shipping, where batteries are too heavy. Aviation, similarly, batteries are being too heavy for long distance aviation. It includes the manufacturing of steel. Steel was responsible for 7% of all our CO2 emissions in the energy sector. We need to move away from using coal to make that steel and instead use clean hydrogen. And there's a number of other sectors, such as fertilizer production, and the chemical industry or cement, that similarly are so-called hard to abate sectors, and clean hydrogen can play a potential role in decarbonizing those. I think we're going to dive more into the details on that in a minute as well.
Absolutely. In fact, why don't we dive in right now? Pasi, can you tell us how hydrogen makes a difference in food production? And first of all, step back and tell us why food production is causing issues with climate change.
When we think of trying to reach the carbon neutral world, it is entirely correct what gentlemen just described, that direct electrification, stop burning fuels for energy is the first measure. Electric vehicles, that's a classical example, heat pumps and so on. Then comes what they call bridging. So you are somehow electrifying indirectly through energy carriers, hydrogen and so on, different kind of industrial processes. So from direct energy you come to materials, whether it's a concrete or then something where you need inherently carbon as a building block like medicine. So how do you provide that carbon in that kind of future when you don't export fossil fuels? Maybe you can capture CO2 from the air. So having done all this and having done research on this for almost 20 years at our National Research Institute, that has been also published at a website, neocarbon.energy.fi. You can find the results from those programs. I went through personal crisis. I realized that even if we would install all these amazing technologies that are existing, by the way, it would not be good enough to save the planet from climate change, because about 1/3 of the climate footprint to human action is due to what we eat. And then we developed a concept, now scaling that to actually produce food by using renewable electricity that happens to be also through using hydrogen. And food system is also very interesting for energy researchers' perspective, because it's a child with multiple problems that have to do. We're fishing out the seas, we're using fertilizers, we're using pesticides, loss of habitat, land use change, loss of carbon when you're cutting forest for agricultural land. So there are problems, all this coming at you. But now through electricity and hydrogen, we can actually disconnect this development and provide even carbon sinks and carbon negative development.
And I have to ask, how does hydrogen, if you can explain how Solar Foods is creating basically a protein out of air, and how hydrogen plays a part in that process?
What we do technically is gas fermentation. So basically, when we scale, we are building breweries. These breweries just happen to be such that when you're making beer or wine, you have a sugar's liquid, which sugar is an agricultural product. So you need some hectares and land use impacts to cause land use impacts. to produce that sugar. So you put that sugar as liquid in a fermenter, you add yeast, and this yeast eats sugar for energy and carbon to be grow, but also express alcohol to surrounding liquid. What we're doing, we have our microbe that is naturally curing, so we're just taking advantage of the diversity of life, but it happens to be specifically hydrogen oxidizing bacteria that uses, instead of sunlight, instead of sugars, hydrogen as a source of energy. So we bubble hydrogen in the fermenter, and this microbe eats that for energy. And we also bubble in carbon dioxide that we can capture from the air, and have been doing so for quite a long time, as a source of carbon. And the efficient machine is this microbe that take advantage of this and convert to anything what a living thing needs. So basically doing, on a higher picture, also same what plants do, but through technology, renewable electricity, hydrogen, and feeding that for the microbe. The microbe, just looking like this, by the way, is a very fine powder, single cells that are nutritionally very close to dried meat.
Thanks a lot. And it's interesting to hear how hydrogen is part of that process. Chris, going back to you, you were talking about CCS, and you were talking about some of the other, the hard to abate industries. In this case, I know you've been working with the oil and gas industry here in the UK. Can you tell us a bit more about HyNet and some of your other projects and how hydrogen is part of that?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. No, really like to do that. So the thing about HyNet is that we have, as I say, probably at least 30 and growing number of industrial users that want hydrogen in order to decarbonize their processes. And I agree with Andreas. I mean, there is going to be a suite of solutions we need. So different solutions. There will be a role for electrification, but I do believe passionately that there will be a role for hydrogen too. So some processes need higher temperatures than you can easily get with electrification. A lot of them, if we converted, most industrial processes, certainly here in the UK, use natural gas to raise heat, either directly with steam or directly onto the products themselves. It's a gas-based fuel. If you change that to electricity, you are ripping out vast quantities of existing infrastructure, existing equipment, and then having to put in new. If we can convert to something like hydrogen, typically it may just be the burners themselves have to get converted out, but a lot of the equipment can stay the same. So in many contexts, hydrogen gives you an easier transition, which is important. It gets you that high temperature. And so those are two key reasons. And I have to say the other one is actually the availability of low carbon electricity. So here in the UK, we're doing incredibly well in terms of offshore wind. So, around 10% of our we're doing very well across all of our electricity, which, almost 50% is low carbon. But probably the biggest contributor to that, and the most growing one, is offshore wind. So that's about 10% at the moment of our electricity, and will grow significantly over the next decade. But to put that in context, actually that offshore wind currently is only about 2% of the total energy flows in the UK. So even if we grow that massively, you've still got a big gap. And of course, a lot of what provides that energy in the UK and in other countries are fossil resources. And we think the logical thing to do is to take those fossil resources, strip out the CO2, put the CO2 back where the fossil resources came from. So you're kind of borrowing the energy from that. You're borrowing effectively the hydrogen energy from the hydrocarbons. And then you use that hydrogen out with all the flexibility and adaptability advantages I've just talked about. So yeah, we're working with people like Unilever that are making a lot of the products that are sitting around in the homes we have today, food and care products. Working with Pilkingtons that make float glass. So that's the glass that goes in pretty much most of our homes, but our big buildings and things. They want to convert their processes, and they are trialing over the next few months. They are going to be run some of their big processes on 100% hydrogen to gain the confidence that when HyNet is delivered and producing hydrogen from 2025, they are there and ready to convert what they're doing to run on low carbon hydrogen.
Thank you. And speaking as someone in the UK, I know that we were speaking before we went live and talking about how some of these places are insulation challenged, shall we say. So
Yeah.
it would be nice to have cheaper fuel for many of us. Can you tell us a bit about high deploy? I think people might be interested in that as well.
So yeah, I mean, much of what we've talked about so far is using hydrogen for industry. And I think universally, there is a recognition that hydrogen has a key part to play in these hard to reach sectors. But I certainly think, certainly here in the UK, there is quite an important role for hydrogen actually in our domestic heating. 83% of our households in the UK are on natural gas. And as we said earlier, our houses in the UK aren't terribly well designed in terms of insulation. We haven't had to. We're not in freezing temperatures in the same way as other parts of the globe. So our houses aren't terribly well insulated. Now, those that are, then converting to heat pumps makes a lot of sense. But actually, where houses are more challenging to insulate, then actually gas heating works very well, because you just heat when you need it for the short time you need it and then turn it off again. But clearly, that's unacceptable because we're going to emit CO2. So we think hydrogen will have a role to play in parts of our domestic heating. And part of the transition, we believe, is to actually blend hydrogen into the grid. So you can make incremental advantages now. It's the urgency, it's the nowness of it. It also means that customers get used to having hydrogen in their home, and we can build the supply chain. So as you say, yeah, Beth, we've got a project called High Deploy. We've just finished the first phase of that. We took Keele University, which is the largest campus university in the UK, and we took their gas network and we ran that for a period of about 18 months on a mixture of hydrogen and natural gas. Nobody had to make any changes to their boilers. They just carried on. In fact, that was the great endorsement of the project at the end was, you know, we didn't even know it was happening. Well, it's not quite true. We did tell people it was happening, but in terms of their experience, it was no different. And yet, through that process, they saved a chunk of carbon during the course of that year. And we want to then roll that out. We're about to start a trial with 650 homes on the public gas network in the Northeast in the next few months. And then we'll be looking to roll this out across the UK in the middle of the decade as part of a transition. It's not an endpoint, but it's a transition to starting to use hydrogen more widely.
All right, thanks for that. Andreas, I wanted to dip down into the recent report that came out from the Energy Transitions Commission a bit. Can you tell us what the main takeaways were as far as hydrogen and dealing with these industrial processes?
Sure, absolutely. I'd love to follow up from what's just been said as well. So when we look at the different demand sectors that we studied, we classified them in 4 different categories. So there is demand for clean hydrogen, and we should be very specific that we're always talking about clean hydrogen here. Hydrogen is already being used in the order of 100 million tons per year. It's almost emitting 1 gigaton of CO2 per year. But that's all fossil hydrogen. We need to decarbonize all of this existing use of fossil hydrogen to clean hydrogen. And that's in usages within refineries, the production of fertilizers, and some other uses in the chemical industry that are really key. And we can switch them over to clean hydrogen relatively easily, such as in projects like HyNet that was just described. Then secondly, we see a bunch of sectors where clean hydrogen will really play a key decarbonization role. And we've briefly touched upon them. So that's steel production, so displacing the coal to make steel. That is shipping, so using clean hydrogen to make ammonia and use that for long distance shipping fuel, as well as using hydrogen to produce synthetic aviation fuel. And lastly, the role of clean hydrogen in power storage, so in balancing our grids. So there we are quite certain that hydrogen really plays a big role in the future in decarbonization. And then there's a series of sectors where it's not entirely clear if hydrogen will necessarily win out over other decarbonization technologies, and it's going to be technology development specific, cost development specific, and location specific. That includes the role of hydrogen in building heating that we talked about, the role of hydrogen in high temperature heat, where there's further developments to be done both for electrification as well as hydrogen, as well as the role of hydrogen in heavy-duty trucking, for example, where we also see developments in batteries becoming better and better, and it's going to be somewhat of a balance there as well. And then lastly, and it was just touched upon, there's a few transitional use cases for hydrogen that may play a role in the sort of intermediate period on our way to net zero. And one of them includes blending into the natural gas grid or blending clean hydrogen into power plants, for example. So that's kind of the different sectors that we think that clean hydrogen really plays a role in, and its specific path towards net zero. But overall, it's going to grow from approximately 100 million tons today of really fossil hydrogen to, we think, is in the order of 500 to 800 million tons of clean hydrogen by 2050. So we are really growing this sector by a factor of 5 to 7 from almost scratch, because clean hydrogen production today is less than 1 million ton. And so there's this huge challenge ahead of us. We've got 30 years time, lots to do in many different sectors to really scale clean hydrogen up. But it's a huge opportunity at the same time.
And Andreas, I agree with you entirely. I mean, the size of the market that we're trying to deal with is so big. And those early areas you talked about, those heavy industry areas, that kind of dispatchable power where you've got storage for grid electricity and things like steelwork and other things. I agree with you. We really do need it. And the market's so big, we almost need to stop worrying about whether we do it in this area or not, but actually just get on and start to get the experience to make it happen, because we'll only really learn by doing, I think is my view.
I think probably at this point, a lot of people are filled with optimism over hydrogen, but also saying to themselves, if it's so great, why weren't we already using hydrogen? If it's been around forever, and why you know, what's going on here? So I'd like to talk a little bit about what the challenges are. For example, Andreas, I think in your report, you talked about possible price rises for steel on the back of some changes, right? And reducing coke and coal, that kind of thing. What are the challenges there? How do public and private partnerships help? Can you dive into that one?
Absolutely. So we call it the cost premium challenge, right? So if you start using clean hydrogen instead of coke and coal in the steel production, the steel you produce, the clean steel, green steel, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be more expensive, at least in the next sort of 10, 15 years, when clean hydrogen prices are still somewhat higher and sort of coming down the cost curve. But in some sectors, this cost premium will even remain up to mid-century. For example, for shipping fuel is so cheap today that using clean ammonia instead of shipping fuel, we are talking about cost increases over 100% of that specific shipping fuel. So there's this cost differential that needs to be covered. And there's a couple of different things that policy plays a huge role in overcoming this critical cost premium. And let me just bring out a few of those. So the role of CO2 pricing is absolutely essential, but it is politically somewhat challenging, but there's a lot of movement on this as well within the EU, but also abroad. But beyond carbon pricing, we're going to need sector-specific policies to actually create early demand to enable projects such as HyNet and others to get going, get started. That includes the role of public procurement, for example. That includes the role of mandates, so that the use of a specific clean hydrogen standard or product standard comes into play. And then we also need investment support and support to overcome the cost differential with mechanisms such as contracts for difference. And lastly, maybe to finish it off on that aspect of what needs to happen to actually get it off the ground and overcome some of these issues is a clean hydrogen certification scheme and a clean product certification scheme, so that we can actually create such a market for these clean hydrogen derived products and voluntary green markets. For example, one example is some car manufacturers such as Mercedes or Volvo are actually going to use green steel now in their cars from 2025 onwards, produced via a hydrogen route. And to do that, they need it to be certified, and they need to be able to call their car, this is a clean steel produced car. and then it may cost a slight bit more, but you're then actually driving in a clean electric vehicle, and I think a lot of people would be willing to pay a slight extra for that particular product. But to be able to create that, we need a certification scheme to move that forward.
So I think Andreas, those are all really good points, and they really lay them out. Can I just go back up to the beginning and I guess just be really clear? We're not necessarily saying that hydrogen itself is expensive. What we're saying is it costs more to do things low carbon today than it does to do things high carbon, because as you say, high carbon solutions have just been dirt cheap. We just whack a hole in the ground and out comes a high carbon bearing fossil resource, and that's fueled our economies for 100 years. I guess what we're saying is that as we go to low carbon solutions, certainly in the transition, they'll inevitably be a bit more expensive, but it's finding the right low carbon solutions to what we need. Longer term, then you can see that then things can settle out and get better. But we've just got to recognize that it's a fact. And I think the other aspect as to why, we've got hydrogen today, why aren't we using it? Well, as Andreas said, using dirty hydrogen doesn't get us anywhere. There's no point in doing that. It's only worth doing it if we're using clean hydrogen, and that can either come from renewable electricity converted to hydrogen, or alternatively, and we think a big part of this is going to be taking our fossil resources, turning them into hydrogen with carbon capture and storage, and then delivering it. So it's the volume that we need, low carbon hydrogen, and absolutely, as Andreas says, we need to manage the transition. And we've done it in the UK. Our offshore wind, first lots of offshore wind were costing £150 a megawatt hour. They're now 40 something pounds a megawatt hour. And that is because we put the right policy kind of frameworks, as Andreas has said, which has led to scale, and scale's led to learning, and learning has led to cost reduction. And we're just in an earlier stage in that evolution with hydrogen, I would say. And that's where the policy interventions need to sit.
Another perspective to, if I may jump in, another perspective, this is to think it in a way that hydrogen itself is not really important, but to do something to the CO2 emissions is. And hydrogen is a more or less obvious, or in some cases surprising solution how to deliver that net result. Carbon pricing was also mentioned by thinking I'm also market liberal and supporting these kind of schemes. But having said that, the most effective, in my opinion, the most effective legislation, perhaps to give one practical example from the European Union, is the maximum emission of the annually sold fleet for car manufacturers. So that really set a ceiling for the sold fleet, and then what kind of technologies you deploy, what are the solutions, then that's for the companies to decide. And then there can be batteries and hydrogen and so on. But the original question was, why is it that we don't have hydrogen around? And one of the reasons is that, starting from the beginning of the industrial era, someone just hit a stick in the ground and there was oil. So we've been pumping that and seeing perhaps end to that at some point. And then hydrogen is there to fill some gaps. And what has happened meanwhile is a thing called technological development. We have now technologies to solve the fossil fuel problem. And when looking at that, analyzing energy sector, food technology, myself, I'm not really an optimist or pessimist, but a possibilist. There are surprising solutions, and I'm every day surprised how fast technologies develop. And I believe solar foods is also one example of surprising future, how hydrogen can be when you compile new technologies on each other. And it doesn't really end there. If I'm allowed to give one practical example to everyone who happen to eat food, meat, the case of meat. So the 80% of the emissions from the food system are due to the concept what we call the animal. And we are also developing of concept, and actually have done already the first trials. It's seemed to work to prepare based on our ingredients, solein, the protein, preparing a growth media based on that and feeding that for cell cultures, for meat cell culture. So at the end, other companies who are developing cultured meat, their cells and their breweries can be empowered by our ingredients. So already, actually, we have today pathway from electricity and hydrogen to real meat cells. And when that arrives on plate, that had nothing to do with current form of agriculture and all the environmental impacts. That's another example of a surprising use of hydrogen. And hydrogen really was not the thing, but it was a vehicle that conveyed and bridged some critical point in the systemic solution.
Thank you, Pasi. And that actually works really well with a question we have received. So I'm going to stay with you on this one. Just to paraphrase, is the lack of high-scale pickup of hydrogen technologies to date a sign that the use of the technology is in question?
No, definitely not. But what happens is that at least those parts of the world that live in market economy, there is a kind of a sequence of things and driven by cost. And what we are seeing now, I gave the example of electrification of transport, and everyone, even us researchers, we have been hugely surprised by the price development decline in the cost of batteries and how fast actually that seems to proceed. Let's see if hydrogen has a role, what kind of role, that's remains to be seen. But if it's cheap, if the vehicles are good, they're providing good service for the consumer, that start to take off. And we are not really massively have entered to those sectors where hydrogen would have a decisive role. After some time, it will definitely come.
Thank you. So I know we are, in fact, we're going past our regular time, but I wanted to get a crystal ball view from each of you on what using hydrogen in the industrial sector will look like in, I'm going to go to 5 years and then 10 years. All right, I'm going to pick one of you to start. Chris, you've got a big smile on your face, so we're going to go with you. What do you think?
So I'll take a view from, and it will be a UK view as to what we're doing. We can be delivering, as I said, low carbon glass, low carbon chemicals, low carbon consumer products, low carbon food. We can be delivering at a scale up in the northwest in our cluster, and we can actually pretty much hit 80% of the government's targets currently of hydrogen production. So that's around 2,000 tons per day of hydrogen in our cluster alone. I'd love to see that happening at the other clusters around the UK, so that we can genuinely be taking big swathes, millions of tons of CO2 out of our energy system by 2030.
All right. Pasi, what do you think? What's the future look like?
Again, I refer to surprise. There will be hydrogen appearing here and there. Some obvious, but also surprising solutions, including ourselves, will be definitely at scale on the market in 2 years, but without mentioning 5 to 10 years. Yeah, that's my take.
Okay, Andreas.
There's going to be lots of movement in the next 5 to 10 years. So we're going to see multiple clusters coming up online, similar to what's described for the UK. We think that the target for 2030 is on the order of 50 million tons of clean hydrogen by 2030. And that means at least, it's going to be in the order of 15 to 20 steel mills. It's going to be a conversion of around half of the refineries and half of the fertilizer plants that we're running today. It's going to really impact many different sectors. We're going to see first shipping and port pilots using clean ammonia. We're going to see some of the first planes flying with synthetic aviation fuel produced from clean hydrogen, etc. So there's going to be a lot of movement to actually, first of all, decarbonize the existing production, but also get the new use cases of clean hydrogen up and going, so we can decarbonize everything else from 2030 onwards to be net zero by 2050.
All right. We're gonna keep this on file and see what happens. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to thank the people who did ask questions. I know we couldn't get to all of them, but feel free to post them and we'll try to answer in the chat. And keep following Climate Champions. Also, check out Platts.com. I know we have some hydrogen events coming up, and there might be some new hydrogen price assessments and insights you'd be interested in.